Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this Wednesday's Global Talk, hosted by the Center for Global Studies. My name is Martin Bunton. I am the Interim Director at the Center for Global Studies. I'm filling in for Oliver Schmidtka, who is the Director of the Center and on a research leave this year. At the Center for Global Studies, we acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Before introducing the speaker, let me just go over a few housekeeping items. We ask that you please keep your microphone muted and your camera turned off until the question and answer period. During the talk, though, please feel free to use the chat feature in the Zoom webinar to engage in any discussion and debate with other participants or to share links and to other resources. After the presentation, there will be a Q&A. To ask a question, you can either use the raise hand function in the Zoom, on your Zoom screen, or you can type a question into the chat box, or you could sort of just wave your hand in the screen and I'll call on you then. We'll ask during the Q&A if you could all please turn your camera on. Leave your microphone muted until you're asking a question or making a comment, but if you could all put your video on, it does a little at least to foster a more involved and welcoming environment and community for discussion. And as you all know, this presentation is being recorded. Thank you for adjusting schedules to be with us on this special afternoon slot. Tremendous pleasure to be able to introduce Edwin Hodge. Actually, for myself to meet Edwin, heard so much about Edwin and his work and his presence at the center, his participation in many forums at the center. Edwin, thank you. Nice to meet you, and thank you for joining us. In addition to being a research fellow at the center, Edwin is an adjunct professor in the Department of Sociology, where he's teaching 2 courses, both of them today too. So another thank you and shout out to Edwin for his participation with us. His research includes extremism, radicalization, conspiratorial ideology, and he has spent several years examining the extreme right in North American society. So thank you so much for being able to join us today and help us understand, talk about how topical a subject this is. Edwin, over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's nice to see everyone, both seeing the faces on the screen and seeing the tiles in the chat. It's good to see, we've got this weird hybrid Zoom thing going on, but it's nice to see so many people showing up and hanging out with us. Thanks again for the invite. I'm just going to quickly share my screen so that you can kind of see, the slides that I've got. Today, I wanted to talk a little bit, to give a little bit of context to the trucker convoy, or the so-called Freedom Convoy that we've been seeing in the news, that we've been seeing around all over our feeds for the last month and a bit. There has been all kinds of discussion back and forth as to exactly who these folks are, what they believe, what they were doing in Ottawa, what they are continuing to do in cities around North America. Now we're seeing sort of something of a successor movement emerging in the United States. Just this past weekend, the so-called People's Convoy, which is the United States version, they declared they were going to shut down Washington, D.C. the same way that truckers in Ottawa did. They were, of course, forbidden from entering the city, and so they spent the last day and a bit circling the Beltway in D.C. and before ultimately being defeated by regular D.C. traffic, and they more or less broke up and scattered to the winds. But I wanted to kind of take a look at how sociological investigations would tackle a phenomenon like the Freedom Convoy, and given the work that I do, the elements that I want to sort of focus on are the more extreme edges of the movement, the ideologies that arguably exist on the fringes, but have been increasingly sort of incorporated into the mainstream of this particular protest movement's ideology. And I want to try to link those elements to the broader context of conspiratorial and radicalized discourse in North American societies, and particularly in the last 2 years or so. This convoy really wouldn't exist if it wasn't for COVID, even though a lot of the elements that make up its sort of ideological foundations predate COVID. This is sort of a COVID era phenomenon. So that's kind of what I want to talk about. This talk is perhaps going to be a little less formal than some of the ones that you may have participated in or watched recently. This isn't a presentation of a completed research project. This is a new phenomenon. And so while I have been doing some informal passive data acquisition over the last couple of months, what I'm really doing today is kind of workshopping an idea for a future project that I have in mind that would sort of spin out of work that I've done before, but will hopefully, even in this talk, I hope that we'll have there'll be a bit more of an understanding of exactly what's going on with these movements. I am absolutely a fan of answering questions as they're typed into the chat. I tend to treat all of my lectures, all of my talks in the COVID era, I treat them all as live stream, like Twitch live streams. So I interact with the chat fairly often. So if you've got a question that's on your mind, go ahead and drop it into the chat, and I'll try to incorporate that answer into the discussion that I'm giving. I also want to keep a fair amount of space free at the end for discussion. So I'll try to move through this at a good pace. So without further ado, let's get the show on the road. Since about January of this year, we have been seeing the emergence of a kind of protest movement. Now, I'm sort of hesitant in the way I'm describing this, because while the physical manifestations of the convoy really have only been around since January, the roots of it actually go back a fair ways into 2021. Certainly the social media dimensions of it, what we might consider sort of the information edge of the social movement, began appearing in social media feeds in August and September. Some of you may have noticed, those of you who pay attention to the kinds of promoted sites or suggested groups or suggested sites that your social media algorithms pop up, you may have noticed that around the fall, the early autumn, fall of 2021, we started seeing more and more images in support of truckers and trucking. Now, the trucking convoy, this freedom convoy, one of its central claims is that it is directly opposed to vaccine mandates that were targeting cross-border truckers. I am somewhat skeptical that that's all that they were about, even at first, only because there seemed to be groundwork being laid for a trucker-focused protest happening months before we saw any kind of manifestations. Now, obviously, that kind of suspicion needs to be validated empirically, and so that would be part of doing a more formal research project on this. But in terms of what we've been seeing in recent months, the biggest convoy that we saw in Canada was, of course, the one that shut down the city center in Ottawa for several weeks. But we have also seen convoys cropping up in major cities all across Canada. And now we're seeing them pop up in the United States. We're even seeing trucker convoys emerging in places like New Zealand, which I find it's a fascinating, sort of like outgrowth of this movement. A lot of the underlying social anxieties that are present in these new international convoys, they reflect the same kinds of social anxieties that we see in the Canadian convoys. The major themes generally center around ending all COVID-related mandates, vaccination mandates, mask mandates, social distancing. It's not just in the case of the Canadian convoys. It's not just a case of truckers demanding an end to cross-border vaccination mandates, right? They've expanded to incorporate all mandates everywhere. The trucker convoy, in a lot of ways, could be characterized as an anti-vax and in fact anti-mask and increasingly an anti-government protest movement. Although a lot of the signs, a lot of the symbols that were being displayed by protesters in Ottawa did focus on this central claim, right? Ending this desire to end vaccine mandates and this desire to end public health mandates more broadly. Other signs and symbols were mixed in with that, right? There was a pretty healthy peppering of other, arguably more conspiratorial messages included in the convoys. This wasn't just the case in Ottawa. It's actually been the case in virtually all of the protests that we've seen. In Victoria last weekend, I happened to be downtown and was watching as some of these convoys were going by, and in addition to the end the mandates or end medical tyranny or remember the Nuremberg Code kinds of signs, there were also signs warning about the Great Reset, warning that these forces of the deep state or these globalists were seeking to take over Canada, or as the sign on the title slide showed, claims that the COVID vaccine itself is a bioweapon that's going to be used to bring about some kind of aggressive population control. These sorts of beliefs, we can argue the extent to which they form sort of central or even important planks in the convoy's ideological framework, but the fact that they are there, present, and seemingly not being pushed back against, seems to indicate that even if the convoys aren't friendly to those ideas, they are at least indifferent to them, right? Which is something to think about. Some of the images that we see associated with the trucking convoy give a kind of worrisome edge to some of the rhetoric that's emerging. Now, it's really important when we're talking about the convoy to establish a kind of context for it. The overwhelming majority of the protesters who are involved in the convoy, in all these convoys, are nonviolent, right? They are protesting what they believe to be infringements on their civil liberties, what they think, they're protesting what they think is government overreach, but they're doing so in ways that are indistinguishable from other forms of protest, right? They're holding up placards. They are blocking traffic. We've seen other protest groups routinely make use of those repertoires of action in other contexts. In Victoria, for example, environmental activists have shut down bridges. They have temporarily blocked ferry access. And so this is a pretty standard tool in the toolkit of protest groups. But others have adopted more radical rhetoric and have wedded that rhetoric to action. As I say, while the majority of folks in Ottawa were nonviolent, irritating, sure, and inconvenient, absolutely, but largely nonviolent. We also have groups like those arrested in Coutts, Alberta, who were part of an Alberta border blocking freedom convoy. They were arrested on a variety of conspiracy charges, criminal conspiracy and weapons charges. They were absolutely committed to expanding their repertoires of action from nonviolent to violent confrontations. We also see that some of the rhetoric that has been floating around in the convoys has been quite worrisome. It's one thing to claim that that vaccine mandates are infringing on your charter rights. It's another thing entirely to claim that that Trudeau is a fascist communist dictator hell-bent on annihilating whole chunks of the Canadian population. But that's what we see in some of the images, some of the rhetoric that's been pulled out of these movement spaces. Some of the spaces that I've been monitoring over the last year and a bit, or not year, sorry, but over the last month and a bit, has been things like TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Telegram, Gab, these sorts of social media networks. Because the movement, a lot of its organizing is happening in these digital spaces. I think it's also important that when we're looking at these sorts of movements, that we interrogate the difference between what the convoy says that it's about and what it's actually doing, right? Its actions versus its rhetoric. It's also really important that we recognize that even if the premise of the convoy is arguable, right? The claim that it's standing in opposition to tyranny and injustice, that sort of thing. The feelings that are expressed by the protesters are very real, right? Even if their anxieties, these folks' anxieties are rooted in erroneous information, right? No, the Canadian government is not engaged in dictatorial overreach. No, the government isn't trying to kill off its citizens or turn truckers into second-class citizens, right? It's not trying to do those things, but the feelings that motivate that rhetoric, the feelings that emerge from that rhetoric and motivate action, those are valid, right? Those are valid, they are real feelings, and trying to dismiss them is unlikely to actually produce anything positive in terms of countering the movement or pulling people away. So that rhetoric is troubling, right? This rhetoric that links Trudeau, in this case, not only to, equating Trudeau with being a murderer, but also a Nazi, right? The S's are clearly SS symbols. That kind of rhetoric has been growing, especially in online spaces. Increasingly, the Canadian government is being accused of being a Nazi and of violating all kinds of international laws against human rights, that sort of thing. But more troubling than that is the incorporation of explicitly extreme ideologies, right? Like legit white nationalist groups, legit anti-government, anti-government or anti-immigration groups, more hardline kind of stuff. For example, this is a screen grab of a TikTok that comes from one of the organizers of the Ottawa rally. Now, for those of you who don't know, this patch is from the Soldiers of Odin. The Soldiers of Odin are a far-right, anti-government, anti-immigration, white nationalist movement. It splintered off from a Swedish and Norwegian group that emerged quite a few years ago. The Soldiers of Odin have been making inroads into Canada over the last few years. They've set up chapters in most Canadian cities. My hometown, actually, a tiny little town in the Okanagan, the founder of the Okanagan chapter of the Soldiers of Odin went to high school with my brother, and he set up a white nationalist paramilitary organization just outside of our hometown. They're all over. They are. There's enough of them that that the RCMP and other law enforcement agencies have grown fairly concerned with them. There's been something of a resurgence of white nationalism in Canada in recent years. That's who the Soldiers of Odin are, and the one of the organizers of the Ottawa rally is boosting them on his TikTok. He's declaring that this is one of the ways that we being obviously white Canadians, can defend ourselves against tyranny, to fight for our country. Now, the we and the our in these call outs is pretty explicit, right? When added to the nature of the message itself, it's pretty clear who the Canadians are that he's calling on, right? It's not immigrant Canadians or racialized Canadians, many of whom are truckers, right? It's white Canadians. During the Victoria rallies, we have seen signs that have been warning against the Great Reset. The Great Reset is a conspiratorial belief that governments of the world, acting usually at the behest of globalists, which is itself just a code for Jewish, that is acting on the behalf of the globalists to effectively tear down capitalist economies and institute global communism. It's a well-worn anti-Semitic trope, and yet we see it fairly commonly in these movements. We've also seen signs warning about the Great Replacement, which is again a white supremacist conspiracy theory, which links increased immigration from non-white countries to threats of racial genocide. We've seen them at these rallies. We have seen Nazi imagery. We've seen the Gadsden flag and other signs that have been appropriated or adopted by white supremacist groups, waving freely in a lot of these rallies. And this is part of this sort of emerging cross-pollination between conspiratorial movements and extremist movements that I've been following for quite a few years. We also see signs related to QAnon, and we have begun to see the Convoy engaging in the same basic patterns of activism that sovereign citizens and freemen on the land engage in. Sovereign citizens and freemen on the land. Sovereign citizens are an American anti-government, anti-tax movement, deeply conspiratorial, often wedded to white nationalism. Their Canadian equivalent is the freemen on the land. And one of the things that they do is they engage in a practice called paper terrorism. This is where they levy bogus liens or other kinds of pseudo-legal paperwork. They'll file liens with offices or with the courts. They'll charge sitting judges and law enforcement or public officials with treason and declare that they've been sentenced to death. And they publish this kind of material. In the COVID context, these same movements have been doing things like drawing up what they call letters or notices of vaccine liability. These are pseudo-legal documents that purport to show that mask requirements, vaccine passports, the vaccination of children, that all of these violate international law, and that anyone who conducts that material or conducts those actions or supports them is basically a war criminal. We've seen these QAnon attach itself to these kinds of movements as well. A QAnon celebrity, Ramana Didulo, she's the so-called Queen of Canada. She's a very influential conspiratorial figure in QAnon circles. She lives in Victoria, and she has declared open season on healthcare workers who administer vaccines. She's called for their deaths, which resulted in the police picking her up and holding her. different individuals who join these movements, they've got their own reasons for joining the protest. And they may have nothing to do with white supremacy. They may have nothing to do with these kinds of conspiratorial beliefs, right? They might have different reasons for joining. But sociological investigations of group phenomenon are often less interested in any one person's reasons for joining these kinds of movements. We're more concerned with the ideological outlook of the group in general. This doesn't mean that we paint the movement with a broad brush, but it does mean that we don't use individual motivations for joining as a counter to more general patterns that emerge from our investigations. So, for example, in this case, the presence of QAnon or Diagolon or white nationalist symbols at the Ottawa protest, it doesn't necessarily mean that the movement as a whole is racist, but their presence does seem to indicate that the space is at best indifferent to them and at worst open to having those ideologies incorporated into their protest. The convoy in Canada claims to be a grassroots movement, and I think there is some truth to that. Certainly a lot of the organizing that we've seen that has taken place has happened at a grassroots level. There hasn't been a recognizable or identifiable sort of main large institution or corporation or group that has been actively recruiting and building these movements. There is a grassroots element. This stuff is sort of just everyday citizens coming together. However, there's more going on than that. For example, when journalists and other investigators took a look at the sources of a lot of the pro-trucker memes and social media posts that had been flooding Facebook and Instagram and these other social media sites for the last few months, when they took a look at the source, they found that a huge amount of that information, the majority of it, was actually coming from two digital marketing companies based in India who have long-standing associations with the Trump campaign, with Donald Trump, and with Trump-related far-right movements. In other words, a huge volume of the information and media of this convoy was coming from transnational sources, right? The claim that the trucking convoy represents all Canadians is demonstrably false. It's absurd on its face. They don't even represent all of truckers, right? Like 90% of truckers are vaccinated, and overwhelmingly truckers and Canadians do not support the claims or ideals of the movement. But this added complexity, finding that a lot of the monetary backing, that the signal boosting for the convoy comes from these external sources, indicates that there's a lot more going on that I think needs to be investigated more deeply. We also know from hacks, various activist groups have hacked the fundraising sites and sort of listserv fee, membership lists of the convoy and of its financial backers, and have discovered that a great deal of the sourcing funding for the convoy comes from the United States, right? That it comes from foreign sources, right? So there is some truth to this idea that the movement is a grassroots one, but there's also a lot of evidence that it is being backed by international money. So I think that that's something that that needs to be investigated more deeply. When I'm talking about these social media memes, this is sort of what I'm talking about. These are a couple of the more widely spread memes online. This top one was spread something like 11 million times, and the bottom one was spread again something like 8 or 9 million times in the last month or so. At least that's just from what I was able to see from the analytics. If you take a look, the top meme has some pretty obvious symbolism in it, right? There is this biblical dimension to it that is pretty clearly the truckers parting the ocean likening the trucks to Moses, or maybe the drivers to Moses. I don't know. It's confusing. Also, there's a shark in there, and I'm not too sure why they put that in there, except that sharks are scary, and I guess parting the water just is driving the fear away. I don't know. Some of the memes are confusing. The bottom one is a little more on the nose, right? The Freedom Convoy rolling in to stop totalitarian governments. In this case, that is Trudeau and Biden, well-known communists, hiding behind the sign as the Freedom Convoy rolls in to drive out the totalitarians. Now, for those of you who are kind of maybe a little confused as to why these memes are evoking such like powerful cultural touchstones, like why would anyone take seriously a meme of trucks parting the Red Sea? It's not the only one. I've got images, I've got memes that show trucks driving in this open space, and all of their beams or their lights are shining these like golden beams of light. And then there's like God rays coming through the clouds that are illuminating the trucks. And then over the trucks is like an angel spreading its wings to like embrace the trucks. This kind of like really high energy, really emotionally evocative imagery serves a purpose, right? It's not just that these are, they're trying to make things look epic, right? There's a purpose, and the purpose is primarily, in my view, to facilitate recruitment into the movement. Social movements like this generally exist as collective challenges to elites, authorities, and opponents, right? And the act of challenging groups or people in positions of power, that act invites risk, right? So a lot of social movement activism, especially that which tries to challenge the status quo or challenge people in positions of power, there is an implied risk, right? Doing this invites challenge. It could invite harm to come to you. In any social movement, this is the case. But the more radical the movement, so the more its message or its goals deviate from the status quo, the more likely it is that members will face risks to their reputations, their livelihoods, even to their safety, right? People who join movements need to really carefully weigh the benefits and risks of joining. And if the risks are too great, they may be deterred from participation, which kind of short circuits a movement like the Convoy. So one of the ways that social movements, especially ones that follow these more radical ideologies, one of the ways they can balance that risk-reward equation is by either minimizing the risk or maximizing the reward, right? You want to change the balance a bit to incentivize people to join more freely. In the case of the Freedom Convoy, generally speaking, there was very little risk to them, but there was also very little in the way of a concrete reward, right? It's really hard to build a movement on a message that reads, join us as we fight for the 10% of Canadian cross-border truckers who choose not to be vaccinated and who will be subject, even if the protest is successful, to American health protocols that are identical to the ones being imposed in Canada. That's not really a message. That's not a message people are going to join with. You're basically saying, if you join us, nothing much will happen to anyone because what we want to change is actually an element of a foreign nation's national security policy. That's not a winning motto. So instead, images and messages that are in favor of the movement magnify the threat identified by the movement and magnify the reward. Right? They magnify the threat to make people more anxious, to go, oh crap, like there's something really serious going on here. And then they magnify the reward so that people look at this magnified threat and go, yeah, that is a risk, right? It's a risk that we're standing up to the elites, but the reward is much greater. There's this greater output or greater outcome. Right. Fighting for the 10% of truckers who suffer a minor inconvenience because of a choice they've made is less appealing than joining with a national movement aimed at fighting back against the encroaching tyranny of the federal government that threatens to end democracy in Canada. Right? This magnification becomes more apparent and important as popular opinion begins to turn, right? At the outset, there was a slim majority of Canadians that seemed to be in favor of the trucker convoys message. But by mid-February, most major polls conducted found that around 65 to 75% of Canadians were opposed to the convoy, and more than two-thirds, excuse me, more than two-thirds of Canadians polled were actually in favor of Trudeau's use of the Emergencies Act. That's pretty impressive. That's pretty impressive that two-thirds of Canadians in this poll were in favor of the state effectively declaring a kind of martial law, or at least a very localized martial law, to clear people out of the capital. By the end of February, the convoy had been associated with white supremacy, anti-government violence, and even isolated cases of interpersonal violence. Even if we assume those associations are false, and there's evidence to indicate that they aren't, it doesn't change the fact that these accusations had the effect of changing the weight of the risk-reward calculation once again, making it more important for the convoy to double down on its claims of standing up for bodily autonomy, human rights, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, democracy, free expression, international law, whatever. So the movement is, at a practical level, is faced with a problem, right? Its concrete concerns are pretty minor and kind of abstract and don't really resonate with a lot of Canadians, right? 10% of truckers are going to have to wait some extra time when they cross the border because they choose not to be vaccinated. That doesn't resonate with a lot of people. So dialing up this rhetoric, dialing it all, doubling down on the threats, changing it into this existential crisis makes it easier for people to get on board, because now they're not fighting for a practical. They're not fighting in protest of a very niche public policy decision. They're now fighting for transcendent values, right? For these sort of sacred values in Canadian society. Okay. Those weren't the only things associated with the movement, though. This is where deeper research into the movement starts coming up with some pretty troubling stuff. People in the convoy, just swearing up and down that they have nothing to do with white supremacy, that has no place in the movement. But when we look at the online dimensions of this movement, we find some pretty damning counter examples to those claims. These are two extremely popular memes that are shared through Telegram, Parler, Gab especially. Right? And Telegram, Parler, and Gab have something of a reputation of being sort of platforms for the far right. There's a certain amount of truth to that. For those of you who don't spend all of your time in some of the darker corners of the internet, allow me to introduce you to Honkler. This is Honkler, this guy right here. Now, if you're looking at this and thinking, what the hell am I looking at? I'll tell you what you're looking at. This is the latest mascot for online white supremacy. He's a symbol for white supremacy in online spaces. Honkler emerged from white nationalist and alt-right spaces in the late 2010s and is related to other white supremacist memes, all of which evolved from an alt-right sort of figure, mascot, whatever, called Pepe the Frog. The character's aesthetic is purposeful, right? It looks goofy for a reason. If you're laughing at it and dismissing it, then you're not stopping it from spreading. Honkler was originally designed to allow white supremacists to infiltrate spaces frequented by children and young teens. It's designed to appear as nothing other than a juvenile, like online, oh, it's just an internet thing. So parents and admins and moderators, people who are sort of out of the loop, will let it pass through. If you're a neo-Nazi these days, you can't just post a swastika, right? People are going to go, oh, well, that's a Nazi. So instead, what you do is you post images like this, right? Honkler. Now, why Honkler? Well, because Honkler, in addition to being part of Pepe, is also, it's sort of a pastiche of Pepe the Frog, which is one meme, and Clown World, which is another white nationalist meme. When you put them together, you get Honkler. Why Clown World? Because if you squeeze a clown's nose, it goes honk, honk, H, Heil Hitler. Now, some of you, I can't see your faces, so I'm going to assume some of you are sitting back going, Edwin, I think you've been on the internet too long and you're maybe seeing things where none exist. That is literally the point of creating a character like this. The idea is to make something so ridiculous that people who identify it as white supremacist spend so much time explaining the associations and connections that they begin to sound kind of unhinged or it sounds like they're reaching. That's literally the point, right? So Honkler is this pretty well-known white nationalist meme, and we see it all through trucker convoy discourse in these liminal spaces, right? These sort of alternative social media networks. And it's designed to be shared quickly, to be, you know, to be easily consumable. Honkler and images related to this are just parts of a larger collection of memes that have been distributed through social media networks in support of the convoy. While it's certainly true that many of the people who rallied in support of the convoy or who even took part in it are not members or even supporters of extremist movements, movement spaces are nevertheless heavily saturated in extremist and conspiratorial imagery. Images taken from the crowds gathered in Ottawa alone show signs ranging from the standard "end the mandate" placards and, you know, and that kind of stuff, to examples of the Gadsden flag, that's the "Don't Tread on Me" rattlesnake flag, the Australian Eureka flag, which in recent years has been appropriated by Australian white nationalist and ultranationalist movements, various QAnon signs, Trump 2020 and Trump 2024 signs, and a host of others, right, all blending together into these spaces. And that's not including the explicit white supremacist and explicit extremist signs that were also present. There were badges and things identified in photographs as belonging to the Three Percenters. The Three Percenters is a radical anti-immigrant, anti-government movement with deep ties to the paramilitary movements in the United States. There were various other patches and images. Diagolon, which is generally considered an online ironic movement, that basically what they want to do is cut North America in half, like on a diagonal. And the East goes to the liberals and the losers, and the West goes to the real patriots and white people. But those were present at the Ottawa rally as well. And they were also present at Coutts, Alberta. Two of the members of the group that were arrested on weapons charges had deep ties to the online Diagolon movement. There's also this other really interesting thing that I was looking at that I think bears closer scrutiny. When you take a look at like Freedom Convoy imagery online, one of the things you'll find are all kinds of marketplaces that pop up that are selling t-shirts, selling merchandise in support of the convoy. And given the sheer volume of these unique stores, right? They're all different stores. It gives the impression that the Convoy is wildly popular, that it has a broad base of support. But one of the things that I did when I started seeing all of these images was I started doing deep dives on their websites, and really quickly it became apparent that of the 20 or 30 of these sites that I looked at, pretty much all of them, with like one or two exceptions, actually are just drawn from two templates. Sort of digital marketplace websites. One template features the name of the shirt, so it'll say like support Freedom Convoy, but it'll be in bold and embedded within an anecdote about skincare routines or a story about like traveling and finding new face creams or whatever. And the other of these templates describes the websites as, and I'm quoting directly, as the exclusive store for the world's best animal-themed apparel, such as lion, donkey, mouse, and so on. In other words, the dozens upon dozens upon dozens of digital marketplaces that appear to be selling merch in support of the Convoy, they all appear to just be cloned stores. And every single one, with one exception, every single one was associated with an American address that when you check records and check where they're located, they are storage facilities in the United States, PO boxes in the United States, townhouses, and in one case, a carpet restoration company. In other words, while the Convoys themselves they represent a small number of Canadians and a tiny number of Americans, and while popular opinion seems to be turning against them quite definitively, there is an online campaign at magnifying their rhetoric, magnifying their symbols, magnifying their presence to make it appear as though the movement is more powerful than it is, right? That it's larger than it is. So even though a lot of the manifestations that we see are in support of Canadian truckers, or at least appear to be, the funding has been decidedly international, as has the cultivation of the conspiratorial elements within the movement. The Three Percenters are an American-based movement, right? It alludes to the myth that only 3% of Americans stood up to the British during the Revolutionary War. The Sovereign Citizens movement started as an American movement, which was imported into Canada and has subsequently been adopted by anti-vax, anti-mask, and convoy sort of supporters. QAnon as well, an American-based conspiratorial movement, which has since been adopted by Canadian anti-vaxxers, anti-maskers, and convoy protesters. While early convoy rhetoric really did focus on claims about standing for freedom from medical coercion, its more recent messaging has included some fairly extreme positions. There was a memorandum of understanding that was floating around on Telegram primarily before it was pulled once reporters got a hold of it. But the memorandum of understanding was published by a group calling itself Canada Unity, which claimed to be speaking for all of Canadians. It was very, very popular in the online chats of convoy organizers and protesters. The group basically argued that that the only way the convoy protest in Ottawa would end was with the removal of Justin Trudeau from office and the elimination of the rest of the Canadian government, just summarily dismissed. In its place, the Governor General of Canada would work with Canada Unity to appoint an advisory committee that would select the relevant experts in law and this sort of thing, and they would comb through the Canadian legal framework, Canadian criminal code, and they would eliminate everything that they believed violated the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, human rights laws, the Nuremberg Code, which is the post-Nazi era legal document which bans human experimentation. There was no discussion of elections. There was no discussion of of representative democracy. It was literally a memorandum calling for a coup against the Canadian state. The document itself, I have a copy of it, and it's absolutely fascinating. It's steeped in what might charitably be called pseudo-legal documentation. It's just nonsense. It's nonsensical legalese, right? It looks legal, but it isn't. This is a really well-worn strategy of the sovereign citizen movement. These groups routinely make use of pseudo-legal documents in their attempts to evade everything from traffic tickets to evictions to contempt of court charges. This rhetoric is found all through this coalition of anti-vax and anti-mask movements, and those groups, the members of those, make up the bulk of the Freedom Convoy. We're also starting to see the framing of mask mandates and their supposed threats to Canadian liberty as a kind of moral panic that positions mandates, and by extension the federal government, as a kind of folk devil that's in need of control or removal. Moral panics like these are dangerous because they often wed heightened levels of anxiety or even paranoia with a specific target whose presence is said to be the cause of all of the group's woes. In the case of other moral panics in Canadian history, specifically ones like the Satanic Panic of the 70s and 80s, folk devils, in the case of the Satanic Panic, groups like atheists, liberals, community outsiders, daycare operators, these folk devils were the frequent targets of attacks. They were ostracized, and they even faced jail time. One couple in the United States was behind bars for 21 years for they were convicted of a crime that they not only didn't commit, but couldn't have committed because the crime violated the laws of physics. But they ended up serving time, 21 years for it. The rhetoric emerging from the trucker convoys across North America increasingly seem to be reflecting that kind of framing, this kind of mandates as moral panic. And we're seeing it not just in Canada, but in the American context as well. Social media has really allowed for the cross-pollination of conspiratorial and extremist ideas into these kinds of protests, right? And I think that there's a few really interesting avenues for future research that we could look at to help us gain a better understanding of what's really going on here. One of the things I was interested in looking at is the role that what I call context debreeding, the role that this process plays in the facilitation of transboundary ideological cross-pollination. In layman's terms, what I'm really saying is I'm really interested to see what role the process of stripping cultural and legal context from an idea, what role that plays in the spread of conspiratorial messaging across national and cultural boundaries. How is it that that Canadians arrested at the Freedom Convoy, why are they standing in front of a judge declaring that the reason they were at the protest is they were exercising their freedom of speech or their First Amendment rights, which literally happened, prompting the judge at the time to say, First Amendment rights, what are those? You're in Canada. So how does this stripping away, this scrubbing off of context, how does that facilitate this sort of cross-pollination? I think we also need to take a closer look at the role that public policy, and specifically public policy messaging, has played in fostering these sort of conspiratorial reactions. One of the most common comments that I get when I'm speaking with people who have embraced this sort of conspiratorial worldview is they'll say, well, what am I supposed to believe? The government changes its message every 5 minutes, or it's super vague, or it'll tell us that COVID is the most dangerous threat that we could possibly face, but that schools, it's okay for kids to go to class, right? The complexities of public health modeling, of looking at which contexts are high risk or low risk for transmission. All the complexities have often been scrubbed out of our public messaging. So the appearance of a kind of fractured or even schizophrenic public policy approach to COVID and to other sort of societal level issues. It would be interesting to see how, what the relationship between those things are. I also think that it would be interesting and potentially very fruitful to do a kind of a large scale network analysis to try to identify these primary points of contact between these grassroots activists and radicalized movements, state actors and their surrogates, and these foreign vectors of aid. So one of the things that's been so fascinating is seeing Canadian truckers in Ottawa reacting with glee that Donald Trump Jr. is live streaming and talking about them and supporting them, and guys like Ted Cruz and others, in the United States, signal boosting this Canadian convoy, and then seeing conservative and Republican donors in those countries funneling money in to support this Canadian event. I think it'd be really interesting to kind of trace the points of contact and trace those networks. For myself, given my position in the university, I'm obsessional, so I don't actually have a research schedule up and running at the moment, but that changes in the fall. And so what I've been doing in the last couple of months I've been engaged in a lot of passive data acquisition. I've been spending a lot of time on Facebook, but also on Telegram, on Parler, Gab, Instagram, TikTok. I even downloaded Zello, which is it's basically like a walkie-talkie app that the Freedom Convoy has been using to have sort of like group calls where they'll all get together and kind of like coordinate strategy. And it's been really interesting to hear some of these recordings. This material can be used as a kind of critical discourse analysis to allow us to sort of see what kinds of value systems, what kinds of broad ideological themes are coming out of these knowledge production spaces. I also think that eventually, in the fall or winter, it would be really interesting to get access, if possible, to some interviews, to sit down and interview participants. I think that would be very interesting, considering that the passive data acquisition provides us with something of a longitudinal data, right? Like we can watch posts from one person over months. And we can watch as their ideas change and their relationship to the movement changes. So I kind of think that these would be really interesting to look at. Obviously, as I said, this is a very embryonic right now, but I think that a study of conspiratorial thinking, a study of this kind of radicalization and extremism is going to have to move into or become a more popular area of research. I don't think we're going to get away from this kind of pattern of practice, at least anytime soon. If anything, it seems like these sorts of movements are proliferating faster than we've seen before. So that's pretty much all I've got. It looks like I hit the 3:30 mark. So bam, there's my questions slide. So I figure now is probably a good time to stop, and we can open it up to discussion and questions.
Okay. Wow. Thank you, Edwin, for all of that. There's a lot of material there for us to digest and discuss further. I will, at this point, ask those who are comfortable to turn on your video, but otherwise, please keep your microphone muted until you have a question. If you have a question or a comment, you can sort of wave and put your hand up, or use the hand function in Zoom, or you can just go to chat and type in the question or comment there, and we'll try to pay attention to all of those. Maria, we'll start with you. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Edwin, for that. That was super interesting. I guess I had one sort of more concrete question, and I was just interested in your take on something. But so I live just 2 blocks from the Ledge downtown, so I've had a front row seat to what's been going on here. And one thing I've seen a lot of that I don't understand the connection of is like, what are the gas cans? Is like, there's one truck that's there every weekend who goes around and around, and he's got like 12 gas cans in the back of his truck. Anyway, so I was wondering if you knew what that was about. And then I also wanted to just hear a little bit of your thoughts about what's happening with the policing, or lack thereof, rather. You know, the easy answer is obviously that the police are just a racist institution. They don't care, but you know, I'm sure that there's more nuance there.
Does there have to be?
Fair point. Anyway, that was it, and thanks again.
Thanks. Those are both awesome questions. As to the gas cans, the only purpose that I know that they're being used for is there's actually gas, and those guys are like mobile refueling stations. Like, they're designed, if any of the convoy runs out of gas, they can fuel them up. But there's also usually messages attached on the gas cans, and I'm not too sure if, like in Victoria, I'm not too sure if the gas cans have taken on a more symbolic meaning, because the gas cans were prominent in the Ottawa occupation, right? Because they were in the downtown core. If you've ever been to Ottawa, there's very few gas stations in the downtown core, so people were running fuel out to them. And so I'm wondering if in Victoria there's some element of like solidarity or something, or this is kind of like that sort of symbol. But I'm not 100% on that. As to the police, let's set aside the sort of the issue of systemic racism, which is perennial in the force. But one of the things that we've noticed is that it's not just the case of, like, you know, the Victoria or the Esquimalt cop like giving a thumbs up, and then the police chief running, you know, giving cover and saying, no, he was supporting the people that were cheering for the police. Where were they in the picture? Were they just magically out of frame? Like, because that's not what it looked like to everyone else. But we also see that in Ottawa and elsewhere, a lot of police unions, police associations are themselves ambivalent about vaccine mandates. And so there is this kind of institutional hesitancy to perhaps police something that, you know, to stop a protest that many of them may actually agree with. Yeah, I have been very troubled by the apparent ease with which the police are able to mobilize militarized elements of law enforcement to go after nonviolent protesters in Fairy Creek, for example, but seem unable to tow a truck out of the downtown, and using transparently false excuses like, oh, I don't know if you've ever tried to move a truck, but when they put their air brakes on, they're immovable. That's not how that works. If that was the case, no tow truck would ever be able to pull an illegally parked vehicle. That's not a thing that exists. So they're transparently false excuses, which of course raises all kinds of flags. Yeah, sorry, I'm getting all dialed up here. Thanks, Maria. Well done.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Evan.
Thanks for that.
Peter Elson.
Hi, and thank you again for a great presentation. I felt like I'd had time in a parallel universe. It's certainly a lot younger. So thank you for the time that you spend on it, because I don't. I guess I got maybe a comment, or I guess 2 questions. One is there a danger of not taking this kind of a movement seriously enough? And secondly, what role do the police play in the actual narrative that these campaigns or this kind of a phenomenon take place? So not related to what the previous question in terms of what are the police doing, but how does the presence or the lack of the presence or the police themselves influence the narrative?
Yeah. Okay. So those are really good questions. In terms of the danger of not taking these groups seriously enough, we've actually seen that at a policy level. In about 2014 or 2015, the government of Canada published a white paper on on extremism, sorry, and what they're finding when we looked at domestic extremism, their findings effectively said that domestic extremism in Canada is isolated, disorganized, and opportunistic. It's none of those things, but the fact that the government chose to frame it in such a way so that they could focus their time and money on external threats actually provided a kind of cover, a kind of space for these movements to grow and proliferate. We hear a lot of talk, for example, about the Proud Boys. They're now defunct, or they say they are, but they played a big role in January 6th in the United States. But they were big in Canada before they were ever big in the United States. One of the oldest Proud Boy chapters was in Vancouver, and it emerged a full year before it started to emerge in New York. So when we downplay them, when we don't take them seriously, we actually open that door to facilitate sort of growth. One of the things I think, to your second question, what role do the police play in the narrative? I mean, this is a kind of a subjective thing. I can only speak for myself, but the way I look at it is if we think about the presence of law enforcement, if we think about law enforcement as the manifestation of control, order, lawfulness, right, all this kind of stuff, and we see law enforcement heavily present at protests like Ferry Creek, Wet'suwet'en, and other spaces, there can be a kind of feeling that that they must be doing something wrong, because why else are the police there, right? Because we have in our cultural narrative this, typically, like, you know, maybe we don't, but a lot of folks in Canada have a belief that police are there to help us, they're there to protect us. So if they're there standing in opposition to somebody, well, those people, maybe they're doing something wrong. In the case of Ottawa, there was very little police presence, right? There was a raging block party for 3 weeks and very little police presence, which, I mean, if we're looking at that, we can't help but wonder, well, if they were doing something so bad, the police would be there. The police aren't there, so maybe what they're doing is actually legitimate, right? That there's all kinds of, you know, this is sort of how I looked at this anyways. I can't sort of speak too much more to that, I guess.
Thank you. Michael, did you want to add to your comment about decoys?
Thanks, Martin. No, not really. I think it's good there. But I will take the opportunity to say, Edwin, thank you for, you know, putting yourself out there on this very current topic when, you know, it's barely a month or two old, and you're sharing all your thoughts with us, and I think that's great. I also think that it's so important that you're sharing kind of a taxonomy of this movement to understand sort of the categories of types of movement and types of ideas that probably most of us should be more familiar with than we are. And one of the things I kept thinking was, this isn't a Canadian movement, this is a transnational movement. And maybe thinking of it as a Canadian movement with these international interventions or sources of funding is not really catching that this is just a Canadian front or face of the movement. And the last thing I wanted to point out too was, I think there's a kind of irony that it's using this frog and this kind of tepid symbolism, and it doesn't exactly scream courageous master race sort of stuff. So you know, just some food for thought. And thank you for the talk.
Yeah, thank you. I actually 100% agree with you. This is not a Canadian. This is not a Canadian movement. This is a transboundary movement. I should have been much more specific in that respect. I sometimes find that because the work I do just sort of assumes that everyone knows that I think that these are transboundary, that just I don't have to explain it, but you're 100% correct. This is a transboundary, this is a transnational movement. We can certainly say, yeah, the Ottawa protest is Canadians coming together and doing this. But as you say, they are a sort of a meat space manifestation of a much broader online ideological movement with roots that we can't really map them easily into these sort of geopolitical spaces. Yeah, it's and also to your point of the taxonomy, yeah, this is one of the things that sort of drives me bonkers is when when I hear stories where people are saying things like, oh yeah, this just came out of nowhere. No, it didn't. Like these signs and symbols have been kicking around for years. Like, you know, we see the news reporting, there was a swastika in Ottawa. It's like, okay, fine. But the presence of one swastika is, in my view, kind of immaterial compared to the deluge of coded white supremacist messaging in these other online spaces. And so without knowing these symbols, it just slips right past us. Yeah. Also, I like your cat.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Michael. Sherry, would you like to turn your microphone on, or would you like me to read the question that you've posted in the chat? I can, why don't I do that? Edwin, the question is, so how does one reason with far-right groups? How do you counter a meme with another meme?
There's a bunch of different...
Sorry, Sherry, I didn't mean to speak on your behalf. Can I? Okay.
Yeah, that's okay. I just wanted to ask that in the comments.
Sherry, it's an awesome question. And it's kind of the $1 million question. And I wish I had a better answer for you, except that all the strategies that we've used thus far are kind of hit or miss. Now, I will draw attention to the fact that you dropped the K-pop meme thing into chat. Yeah, one of the most successful ways of jamming these groups' messages, jamming the spread, is the co-opting of their hashtags and the co-opting of their online threads by fandoms like K-pop fandoms. Like when we look at like, so a Trump rally trying to sell tickets or give away tickets to pack the seats of a Trump rally to make it seem like he's the most popular guy in the world, and no one can get access to the tickets because K-pop fans had flooded the website and taken all of the tickets away, was just like, it's just brilliant. That kind of rhetoric or that kind of activism really does work. It shuts down or dilutes the message. It makes it harder for the message to get out. Now, how do we talk to people in far-right groups and get them to, and pull them out? The short answer is we don't. You can't pull someone out of a belief. That's not how beliefs work. You going up to them and saying like, don't you know that's bigoted? Their response is like, you're brainwashed, I don't care, right? You can't pull someone out of a position that they're ideologically committed to. But what we can do is sort of fracture the sort of the knowledge production nodes that inform their beliefs. We can do things like open them up using the Socratic method. Say things like, oh, okay, so you think that that vaccine mandates are a violation of your charter rights. Explain that to me. Walk me through. How does that work for you? What are you seeing there? Get them to talk about a thing that they clearly love to talk about. And the idea is to move them towards the kind of logical gaps, the kind of holes in their arguments. You're not going to point them out and be like, I got you, it's wrong. You want them to get to a point where they're like, I can't explain that. Because even if they, in the moment, dismiss it and are like, okay, well, I'll think about something else. In the back of their mind, often that will it'll kind of percolate. It'll begin to sort of gnaw away at those beliefs a little bit. It causes them to question things. The other thing you can do is identify where they're getting this information from and suggest that they step back from it. If they're getting the majority of their news from their Facebook feeds, suggest that they do a social media cleanse. Say to them, like, listen, how about you and I step away from social media for a month, right? Absence, distance, do a lot of work in de-radicalization. But there's no easy answer. There's no one strategy. I'm sorry.
Oliver, can I call on you?
Yeah, that was wonderful. I mean, I don't know if wonderful is the right word. It was insightful, probably disturbing, helpful, certainly, because I think a lot of us are grappling with it. I do a lot of public policy work, and I have the good fortune of working with some people that do sort of opinion research for really long arc stuff, usually around environment or sustainability themed. And, you know, their work has also been sort of trying to understand the ideological connections. And so a couple of observations. One is, you know, you kind of alluded to it, and I think we all agree that Ottawa isn't just a Canadian thing, right? And so the role of this as a test is certainly something that comes up a lot with some of these folks. Now, it's not my area, but that's their area. And they keep emphasizing the importance of belonging, in the sense that you know, in engagement organizing, like the positive stuff, social change kind of stuff that we like, that's a really powerful tool. And we're seeing it sort of deployed in the sort of more dark and sinister way. And it relates to, I think, a comment you made up front, which was, this is somewhat unique or perhaps driven by COVID. And I'm wondering if that's part of what you're connecting. And so I guess that's kind of one bundle of questions I have. I would just love you to reflect if you see any value in that. You know, some of my colleagues in that field, you know, they're really quite alert or quite fearful of both the January 6th US thing and this as part of just tests. They're testing to understand the opponent, in this case, the state's reaction and where the weaknesses are, and that something much more sinister or concerning might start. And now is the part where I kind of go into the realm of the maybe sounding crazy, but it seems like there could be a connection here, you know, to tie it to the global that we're talking about, like the Russian efforts to destabilize democratic institutions. I mean, arguably connections to Trump, certainly what we're seeing currently happening in the context of Ukraine. Is any of your sort of passive research showing that connection? Because you mentioned some of the money connection, which of course is critical, but if we can begin elevating that connection, that would seem pretty powerful, because that's when it gets really disturbing, where these sort of what you call almost like, you know, is this a Mr. Bean episode, or is this really real, right? January 6th had that feeling. I felt like the beginning of the convoy had that feeling, like, is this a comedy or is this a tragedy? I'm not sure. But if we begin tying those together, I certainly get that very uncomfortable feeling. And I just don't know if that's just me being paranoid or needing to belong somewhere, or if it's actually something worth keeping our eye on. Thank you.
These are all good questions and really helpful observations. Identity formation, finding belief and belonging in these movements. It's a core component of social movement activism. One of the things that keeps movements together over time is a sense of collective belief and a sense of collective identity. We don't just see that in things like Black Lives Matter or in environmental movements. We see it in neo-Nazi groups. We see it in conspiratorial movements. You come together, you feel isolated and alone because the things you believe don't seem to resonate with anybody else. And then you find a group of people who are all saying, even if they're saying different sort of things, they're saying it in the same kind of way. It makes us feel like we belong to something bigger than ourselves. And so that becomes it's a very powerful, very natural draw. One of the things I say to my students when I'm talking about this stuff is people are drawn to these movements for rational reasons. And one of them is identity, is belonging. Now, the question that you had about the role that Russia plays, that's certainly on the minds of law enforcement and intelligence communities, both in Canada and the United States and elsewhere. There has been some reporting from groups like CSIS, groups like Homeland Security and the FBI and others that have seemed to indicate that that at least some of the funding for the social media elements of this have been tied to Russia. And one of the things that several journalists who make heavy use of Twitter in their day-to-day have noted is with the invasion of Ukraine, the sort of pro-freedom, pro-convoy kind of messaging has all but disappeared. It's just dried up as as people seem to be ramping up this, shifting focus to Ukraine. Now, I absolutely think that that's an area that's got to be researched more fully, because right now, as Michael rightly pointed out, this is brand new. Like we're in the middle of it. We actually don't have enough distance to be able to engage fully in the kind of academic work that we do. But this is something I think we should be looking at more seriously. I don't think it's crazy or conspiratorial to think, like, we know that Russian troll farms are years ahead of the West when it comes to engaging in this kind of propaganda war. We've known this for a long time. And so it is not unreasonable to think that to hypothesize that there might be some involvement. I think we just need to do more study. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. And of course, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean people aren't.
Doesn't mean people are out to get you. Yeah.
Hey, Edwin, you're very good at following chat. There's an interesting kind of conversation going on, and I think basically around censorship and what actually. Can you respond to that?
Yeah. So I'm checking it out, and one of the counter positions. So far we seem to see the emergence of two sides to this, right? One is, okay, so how do we deal with this kind of rhetoric? Do we drag it out in an extremist ideology? Do we drag it out into the light and expose it, or do we try to tamp it down, right? Do we try to repress it or censor it? We actually have examples from the last decade of people trying to do both of those things, right? Think of the explosive growth of the alt-right. Guys like Milo Yiannopoulos, the sort of classical liberal position in this kind of debate is drag these ideas out into the light, expose them to the air, and let people see what's going on. They'll see the absurdity of the position. They'll see the challenges to that position, and the position may collapse. What actually happened was we catapulted those folks to superstardom. Milo Yiannopoulos went from being an obscure grifter on a British tech blog to going on Real Time with Bill Maher and Joe Rogan's podcast, where he received uncritical space to air his views, resulting in the almost a forced multiplication of his message. He was giving public talks on universities who were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on security to defend students against violence at these rallies. It didn't seem to have much of a dampening effect on Milo's career or on similar people. Steve Bannon, right? He was another one. The only thing that ruined Milo's career had nothing to do with exposing his bad racist ideas. It was his defense of pedophilia, which is like literally the only thing that brought him down was a violation of a taboo. Everything else seemed to be fair game. On the other hand, what have we seen in the wake of Charlottesville, right? The wake of Charlottesville, we saw whole-scale deplatforming of white supremacists, the demonetizing of extremist videos on YouTube, the canceling of their accounts on Patreon and PayPal and others. And what was the result? Their followers collapsed. Right now, the ideas don't go away. You can't destroy an idea, right? That they just kick around. But it made them harder to access, right? Google dropped them off of their feeds, made it harder to access. Now, I think Michael said in the chat, well, they just moved to other echo chambers. Yeah, so what? The moving to Telegram from Reddit is a difference without a distinction. The echo chamber on Reddit just moved to the echo chamber on Telegram, but the only difference is that Telegram, it doesn't have nearly the reach or scope that Twitter or Reddit did. So I'm not saying there's a right answer to this, but what I am saying is based on the research that I've been doing, there does appear to be more perhaps utility in the pragmatic approach of not giving howling bigots a sort of a public venue to speak. I think that's, I mean, we're getting into all kinds of debates about our value systems, but I've never particularly been interested in opening space for people whose ideology, if it were allowed to blossom, would result in me being lined up against a wall. It just seems like seems like a bad plan to me. Call me
on that note, Edwin, we have a few things to wrap up, including to thank you. But also, can I just direct everybody's attention to the chat, where Sherry's also posted some links to a front burner episode on CBC that talks about the links to this physical wellness too. Before I thank Edwin for this fascinating and so important and sobering talk, I just want to draw your attention to a few events coming up in the next week or so. And we have a slide to help me remember this, and also to help you sort of take stock. On Thursday, March 17th, he pauses to, we have a talk by Jeff Briscoe from, I want to say University of Waterloo. Laurier. And he's going to talk about a big short grant to which he participates on Ghana Youth and the videos that they're producing. So that's not a global talk on Wednesday, it's the next day, the Thursday, 10:30 to 12 on the 17th. I'm very excited to host that. World Water Day is coming up. And as usual, Polis has a very exciting event organized for the evening. So March 22nd from 7 to 8:30, Polis is presenting What's Beneath Our Feet? Short films and insightful conversations about groundwater on World Water Day. And sort of somewhat inspired by Sergey's talk last week, and just the significance of, or the potential, and the significance and the potential changes that could be taking place as a result of Russian invasion of Ukraine. We thought perhaps we could organize some very sort of ad hoc, temporary, we don't know how long they'll last, but just on Tuesdays at 2 p.m. to gather in the front area hallways of the Center for Global Studies, bring your coffee, something to eat, and we'll just have a series of chats around current events, based around events on Ukraine, but taking us anywhere from discussions, maybe regional ones in terms of Europe and China and the Middle East, or thematic ones, future of sanctions, no-fly zones, food supply chains, etc. So please join us on Tuesdays at 2 in the hallway of the Center for Global Studies with a cup of coffee, and we'll just kind of try to keep, in an informal way, those conversations going. Edwin, thank you so much. My goodness, how fortunate we are that we can draw on your resources, your knowledge, your assessments to help us through what is such an important subject, and yet the difficulty of us to struggle with all of these important developments percolating at the same time. So Edwin, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me, everyone.
Thank you, Edwin. That was great.
One more thank you. Goodness gracious. I mean, I hope that every day I express my gratitude to the amazing women in these hallways, but on the week of International Women's Day, let me also kind of a huge shout out and thanks to all who contribute to all the women who contribute to making the center what it is. So thank you.